She waved goodbye to her bridesmaids. No one knew it was the last time anyone would ever see her alive. It was the morning of June 17th, 1989, in the quiet town of Maple Falls, Pennsylvania. A town with one main street, a church that still rang its bells by hand, and a population where everyone knew everyone. Weddings in Maple Falls weren't just family affairs, they were community events. And on this summer morning, excitement buzzed like electricity through the town. The bride, 23-year-old Lydia Caldwell, was supposed to have the happiest day of her life. Friends remembered how she twirled around the living room in her wedding dress 2 nights earlier, laughing until she couldn't breathe. She was the kind of person people described as sunshine in a bottle. Golden blonde hair, a laugh that carried, and a habit of leaving notes for her loved ones on scraps of paper tucked into lunch bags and glove compartments. But that morning, beneath the lace veil and the pinned curls, there was something else, something unsettled. One bridesmaid years later said she noticed Lydia staring out the window of the bridal suite, her fingers trembling just slightly as she held her bouquet. She looked distracted, she recalled, like her mind was somewhere else. At 10:30 that morning, the bridal party posed for photos on the church steps. At 11:15, Lydia said she needed a moment to herself. She slipped away, leaving her bouquet on a chair. She never came back. The first half hour didn't set off alarms. People assumed she was fixing her makeup or maybe gathering her nerves. Weddings were stressful. But as the minutes passed, unease turned to whispers, and whispers turned to panic. By noon, when she should have been walking down the aisle, there was no bride. Her fiancé, David Harper, stood at the altar, clutching his hands, looking pale and bewildered as guests shifted uncomfortably in the pews. Outside, her father paced, demanding answers from anyone who would listen. And somewhere in that small town, the woman everyone loved had vanished. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Lydia Caldwell grew up on the edge of Maple Falls, in a white farmhouse with peeling paint and a front porch swing that creaked when the wind blew. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were steady. Her father, Richard, worked at the paper mill. Her mother, Elaine, taught Sunday school at the Methodist church. Lydia was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between her protective older brother, Mark, and her younger sister, Jenny, who followed her around like a shadow. She was a dreamer from the start. Teachers remembered her doodling wedding gowns in the margins of her notebooks, sketching delicate lace sleeves and flowing skirts when she should have been solving math problems. She sang in the church choir, starred in the high school play, and always seemed to have a camera pointed at her, thanks to her best friend, Claire, who was forever documenting their lives on her bulky 80s camcorder. By her late teens, Lydia had one goal. She wanted to leave Maple Falls, not because she hated it, but because she believed the world was bigger. She wanted to see cities, maybe even move somewhere like Philadelphia or New York, but those dreams were tempered by responsibility. When her mother fell ill for a spell in 1986, Lydia put college on hold to help care for her sister in the house. That same year, she met David Harper. David was everything her parents approved of: tall, soft-spoken, steady. He worked at his family's hardware store, and he treated Lydia with a quiet kind of reverence. Theirs wasn't a fiery romance, more like an arrangement that bloomed into love over time. They met at a church picnic, went for milkshakes at the diner, and by the spring of 1988, he proposed. Friends said she seemed happy, though some noticed the way her smile sometimes faltered when wedding plans came up. She loved David, sure, one friend recalled, but she also talked a lot about the life she thought she might have missed. She wanted to travel, to try things. I don't think she was ready to settle down yet. But back then, in our town, people married young. It was what you did. The wedding was set for June 17th, 1989. The whole town buzzed with anticipation. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The reception hall, a converted barn, smelled of fresh paint where volunteers had touched up the walls. Lydia's dress, carefully sewn by her aunt, hung in her bedroom like a promise. But beneath the excitement, tension was brewing. Some say she confided to her sister Jenny that she wasn't sure, that maybe she was rushing into something she couldn't undo. Jenny would later tell investigators that Lydia had cried in her bedroom one night, whispering, "What if I don't want this life? What if I want something more?" Still, no one thought she would run. On the morning of the wedding, Lydia woke early. She ate toast in the kitchen while her father read the paper. She hummed softly as she poured coffee, a nervous habit. By 8:30, the bridal party gathered at the church. Hair was sprayed high, blush was applied thick, and cameras clicked. Lydia laughed with her bridesmaids, teasing about how much hairspray was in the air. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. At 11:15, she slipped away. No one saw her leave through the front doors. No one saw her at the side entrance. Her car was still parked outside, keys on the seat. It was as though she vanished into thin air. When her absence became undeniable, chaos unfolded. Guests whispered about runaway brides. Some believed she had second thoughts and bolted. Others thought something more sinister had happened. Her fiancé, David, insisted she would never abandon him. "Something's wrong," he told police. "She wouldn't just leave." His voice cracked as he said it, tears blurring his eyes. Her father was furious, alternating between demanding a full police search and shouting at David for not knowing where she might have gone. Her mother sat in stunned silence, clutching Lydia's abandoned bouquet like it was a lifeline. By that evening, Maple Falls was transformed. Flyers with her smiling face were posted on lampposts. Volunteers combed fields and riverbanks with flashlights. Police dogs tracked her scent to the edge of the churchyard, then lost it. And the questions began. Did Lydia run away from her own wedding? Was she taken by someone lurking nearby? Or was the truth something far darker, buried beneath the town's picture-perfect surface? What no one knew then, what no one could imagine, was that 35 years later, a forgotten videotape would reveal the answer. The first 24 hours after Lydia vanished were critical. Police interviewed her friends, her family, and her fiancé. They searched her room, finding only her neatly folded pajamas on the bed and a half-written letter to a friend about how nervous she was. But the strangest thing wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. Her purse, her car keys, her shoes all still there. She hadn't taken anything with her. No money, no clothes, no sign of preparation. For a runaway, it didn't make sense. For a bride snatched away, it was chilling. Witnesses came forward. A neighbor swore they saw a dark sedan parked near the church that morning. Another said they heard a woman scream faintly near the woods behind the property, though no one else recalled it. Police logged every tip, but nothing stuck. By the end of that first week, the once joyful town of Maple Falls was heavy with suspicion. Doors were locked at night. Parents kept children close. Whispers of blame crept into every conversation. Some looked at David, others at her family, others still at the strangers who sometimes drifted into town from the highway. No one knew the truth. But one thing was certain. The bride, who had vanished on her wedding day, had left behind a mystery that would haunt Maple Falls for decades. And the answers, as they would one day learn, were captured quietly on a videotape that had been sitting, forgotten, in an attic box. To understand how a bride could vanish in broad daylight, you have to understand Maple Falls. Back in 1989, the town looked like something out of a postcard. Rows of clapboard houses with porches, screen doors that slapped shut, kids riding bikes down cracked sidewalks. On Friday nights, the high school football field filled with the smell of popcorn and diesel from the tractors parked along the fence. On Sundays, church bells marked the rhythm of life, pulling people into wooden pews that creaked when you Saturday. It was the kind of town where secrets had nowhere to hide, or at least, that's what people thought. The Caldwell family had lived there for 3 generations. Their farmhouse sat on the far edge of town, surrounded by fields of tall grass that swayed in the summer wind. From the porch, you could see the mill in the distance, its smokestack puffing into the sky. Richard Caldwell, Lydia's father, worked there his whole life, starting at 16. His hands were calloused, his back permanently bent from lifting and hauling. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Her mother, Elaine, was the opposite. Warm, talkative, always ready with a pie or a casserole. She was known for her Sunday school lessons, where she told stories in a way that made even restless kids lean forward. But she carried her own struggles, too. Years earlier, she had battled a sickness that left her weak for months. Lydia, being the dependable middle child, stepped up, cooked, cleaned, and watched her little sister, Jenny. People said that responsibility aged her quicker than most girls her age. Her older brother, Mark, was already out of the house by 1989. He worked construction jobs up north, showing up every few weeks with stories of bigger cities, bigger paychecks, and bigger trouble. He loved his sister fiercely, though, and always promised that one day he'd take her traveling, just the two of them. That promise would weigh heavy in the years to come. Then there was Jenny, the youngest. 14 years old that summer, still in braces, still scribbling in diaries covered in stickers. She worshipped her older sister. If Lydia curled her hair, Jenny tried to curl hers. If Lydia wore red lipstick, Jenny stole the tube and smeared it across her own lips in the mirror. She wanted to be her. And losing her, so suddenly, would mark her for life. But it wasn't just the Caldwells who shaped Lydia's world. It was Maple Falls itself. The town carried an old, unspoken code. Appearances mattered. People mowed their lawns, swept their porches, painted over the cracks, but beneath the tidy image, there were fractures. Everyone knew which families were feuding, who owed money at the hardware store, who drank too much at the bar on Main Street. When Lydia got engaged to David Harper, most people nodded in approval. The Harpers were well regarded. They owned Harper's Hardware, a store that had been there since the 1950s. David was considered a good catch, hardworking, polite, never in trouble. To the outside world, he and Lydia were the perfect couple. But perfect, in Maple Falls, was often a performance. Lydia's friends knew she had doubts. Not about David as a person. He was kind, dependable, but about the path her life seemed to be taking. More than once, she told Claire, her best friend with the camcorder, that she felt like she was standing at a fork in the road. "It's like I'm supposed to choose the life everyone expects," she said once, while they sat on Claire's bedroom floor eating Doritos, "or the life I imagine when I close my eyes. And I don't know which one is really mine." Claire remembered her saying that, and years later, she would wonder if Lydia had been sending out a warning all along. Still, the town didn't see any of that. They saw a radiant bride-to-be, planning the kind of wedding people whispered about for weeks. The church draped in flowers, plans triver workins per the pause, pot of the common is paused. The reception hall decked in fairy lights, Lydia in her hand-sewn gown, looking like she had stepped out of a bridal magazine. But behind closed doors, the Caldwell household was tense. Weddings cost money, more than they really had. Richard grumbled about bills piling up. Elaine pushed for traditions that Lydia didn't care about, like the exact placement of the unity candle. And Lydia herself was caught in the middle, smiling outwardly while secretly scrawling nervous thoughts in her journal. One entry, found later, read, "What if forever feels like a cage?" The week before the wedding, Maple Falls was buzzing. At the diner, waitresses poured coffee while gossip flowed about who would wear what band was playing, and whether the Harper-Caldwell Union would be the biggest event the town had seen in years. The church ladies practiced the hymns. Kids rehearsed their flower girl and ring-bearer roles. The reception hall smelled of sawdust from last-minute repairs, and someone had strung up paper lanterns that fluttered whenever the barn doors opened. It was picturesque, too picturesque, almost like a set waiting for its tragedy. And Lydia, she played her part, smiled for photographs, tried on her dress again and again, thanked people for their help. But every so often, someone would catch her expression slipping. Her sister Jenny swore she saw Lydia staring into the mirror, lips pressed tight like she was fighting back tears. When asked about it later, Jenny said, "I thought it was just nerves, cold feet. I didn't think it was the kind of fear that makes you disappear." David, for his part, seemed genuinely excited. Friends said he beamed whenever Lydia walked into the room. He wasn't flashy, not the kind of man who made grand gestures. Instead, he was steady, reliable. He had their starter home ready, a little yellow house not far from the hardware store. He talked about kids, about growing old together. But he also had a temper, small, quiet flashes of it. A slammed door, a clipped word. Nothing violent, but enough that Lydia once confided to Claire, "Sometimes I feel like I don't really know him, like there's a part of him I can't reach." It wasn't enough to make her call off the wedding. At least, not officially. The night before the ceremony, the Caldwell house was filled with noise, relatives arriving, cousins running through the halls, pots clanging in the kitchen. Lydia disappeared upstairs for a while, and Jenny followed. She found her sister sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her dress from the rehearsal dinner, staring at the floor. "Are you okay?" Jenny asked. Lydia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just keep thinking," she whispered. "This is the last night I'll ever be just me." Jenny didn't understand then. She thought it was just wedding jitters, but those words would echo in her mind for decades. The morning of June 17th dawned warm and bright. The air smelled of cut grass and honeysuckle. Church bells rang at 8. People ironed dresses and suits, polished shoes, and gathered gifts. By 9:30, the churchyard was alive with chatter. Guests mingled, photographers snapped shots of flowers, and the organist practiced scales that drifted out the open windows. Inside, the bridal suite buzzed with hairspray and laughter. Bridesmaids clinked glasses of champagne. Jenny helped her sister into her gown, tugging the lace sleeves into place. For a moment, Lydia looked radiant again, her nerves hidden. But Claire, holding her ever-present camcorder, caught something else. A flicker in Lydia's eyes, just for a second, when she thought no one was looking. A kind of distant fear. At 11:15, Lydia stepped out into the hallway. She told her bridesmaids she needed a breath of air. She left her bouquet behind. And then, she was gone. When news spread that the bride had vanished, Maple Falls froze. The perfect little town was suddenly a stage for something it had never seen before, a mystery that would not go away. People locked their doors for the first time in years. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter, and whispers grew louder with every passing day. Some whispered about a runaway bride. Others muttered about darker possibilities, abduction, betrayal, even murder. But none of them guessed the truth, that somewhere, sealed in magnetic tape, Lydia's last moments had been recorded, waiting 35 years to be found. And while that tape sat gathering dust in a forgotten attic, the people of Maple Falls began their frantic search. Because by the afternoon of June 17th, it was clear. Lydia Caldwell hadn't just gotten cold feet, she had vanished into thin air. The morning Lydia Caldwell vanished, Maple Falls woke up to celebration. By 7 o'clock, sunlight spilled across Main Street, bouncing off shop windows and warming the sidewalks. Birds sang in the trees that lined the churchyard. People waved to one another as they carried garment bags and wrapped gifts, the whole town buzzing like it was Christmas morning. For weeks, this wedding had been the headline of small-town conversation. The Caldwell-Harper ceremony wasn't just about two people joining together. It was about two families, two pillars of the community, cementing their place in Maple Falls history. For many, it felt like a royal event in miniature. And Lydia, the bride at the center of it all, was awake before dawn. Her sister Jenny would later describe creeping into Lydia's room around 6:30 that morning. She found her sister sitting by the window in her robe, her veil spread out across her lap like snow. Lydia had a cup of coffee in her hands, but it had gone cold. She was just staring out at the fields. "You nervous?" Jenny asked. Lydia smiled, a quick, practice thing. "A little," she admitted. But there was something in her voice, something Jenny couldn't quite place. Later, she'd wonder if it had been fear. Downstairs, the Caldwell house was alive with noise. Relatives fussed over ties and dresses. Richard, their father, paced with his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, grumbling about being late. Elaine hummed in the kitchen as she laid out breakfast. Nobody really touched. The air was thick with perfume, hairspray, and excitement. By 8:30, cars lined the driveway. Bridesmaids piled in, giggling and adjusting their curls. The photographer arrived, carrying bags of lenses and rolls of film. The mood was hectic but cheerful, the kind of controlled chaos that comes with weddings. And in the middle of it all, Lydia seemed to float. She let her mother button her gown, let her aunt fix her hair, let her bridesmaids tug at her sleeves. She smiled for the cameras, laughed at the jokes, but whenever she thought no one was watching, her eyes flicked to the window. At the church, the preparations were nearly complete. Volunteers had spent the past week stringing ribbons across the pews, polishing the brass candlesticks, and arranging bouquets of white roses. The old wooden floor creaked under footsteps. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the walls with patches of color. By 10, the guests began to arrive. Women in floral dresses fanned themselves in the June heat. Men adjusted ties and checked watches. The organist rehearsed softly, the notes drifting through the church like a promise of joy. Outside, children ran in circles, their laughter echoing across the lawn. The scent of roses mingled with cut grass, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. It was, by all appearances, the perfect day for a wedding. And yet, inside the bridal suite, a different mood was taking shape. The room was crowded with bridesmaids, makeup artists, and the constant flash of cameras. Someone popped open a bottle of champagne. Laughter bubbled up. The air grew warm and heavy with perfume and powder. Lydia sat before the mirror, her gown spilling around her like a cloud. Her hair was pinned into an elegant twist, curls framing her face. On the surface, she looked radiant. but her hands betrayed her. Her fingers tapped against the vanity, restless, nervous. At one point, Claire, her best friend with the camcorder, leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" Lydia looked at her through the mirror. For a second, her mask slipped. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. Then she smiled. "Yeah, just a lot of people out there." But later, when Claire watched the footage she had recorded that morning, she would swear she saw something in Lydia's expression. A shadow, a hesitation. By 10:30, the official portraits began. Lydia and her bridesmaids posed on the church steps, the photographer calling out instructions. The sun was hot, and sweat prickled beneath the layers of silk and lace. Lydia squinted into the light, her smile strained but beautiful. Behind her, David stood with his groomsmen, straightening his tie for the 100th time. He looked calm, collected, the picture of a groom. But those who knew him well noticed the way his jaw tightened when he glanced at Lydia. It was subtle, but it was there. When the photographs wrapped up, everyone filed back inside. The bridal party returned to their suite. Guests settled into pews, fanning themselves with programs. The organist struck a few more notes. Everything was in place, except Lydia. At 11:15, just 45 minutes before the ceremony, Lydia excused herself. "I just need a second," she told her bridesmaids, setting her bouquet down on a chair. She stepped into the hallway, her gown rustling as she walked. The bridesmaids assumed she was going to the bathroom or stepping outside for fresh air. No one thought twice about it. But minutes passed, then more. When someone went to check, she wasn't there. Her car was still in the parking lot, her purse and shoes still in the bridal suite. The back doors of the church stood open, letting in a breeze, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. At first, people laughed nervously. "She's just having a moment," one bridesmaid said. "Cold feet, maybe." But as noon drew closer, laughter turned into whispers. The organist, waiting for his cue, repeated the same notes. The guests shifted in their seats. David stood at the altar, sweating under his jacket, glancing at the doors again and again. Finally, Richard Caldwell stormed through the church, his face red. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded. But no one could answer. By 12:15, panic had fully set in. Bridesmaids cried. Jenny ran across the churchyard, shouting her sister's name. Volunteers fanned out, checking bathrooms, cars, even the woods beyond the parking lot. And still, no bride. Later, people would describe the moment with eerie detail. The church, once filled with music and chatter, fell silent except for the creak of pews and the rustle of programs. Guests avoided each other's eyes. Some left quietly, others lingered in disbelief. In the bridal suite, Lydia's bouquet sat wilting on the chair, abandoned. A glass of champagne stood half empty on the vanity, a lipstick print stained a tissue. Her dress bag, still hanging in the corner, swayed slightly as if someone had brushed past it. Small details, frozen in time. By that evening, Maple Falls was in chaos. Police cars circled the churchyard, flashlights swept through the fields, search dogs barked into the night. Volunteers carried lanterns and called her name until their voices cracked. But it was no use. Lydia Caldwell was gone. And the town would never be the same again. What happened between 11:15 and 12 noon on June 17, 1989? That question haunted everyone who knew her. Some believed she ran, some believed she was taken, and some whispered that the truth was darker, closer, buried in the people she trusted most. But the strangest part of all? Her last moments that morning were captured, quietly, unknowingly, on tape. A tape that would not resurface until 35 years later. At first, no one wanted to believe it. A bride walking out before her vows was the stuff of movies, not Maple Falls. People whispered that she was probably hiding somewhere nearby, gathering her nerves. Someone said maybe she had gone to splash her face with water. Another guessed she had fainted from the heat. But as minutes turned into an hour, the laughter drained out of the church. A heaviness settled over the pews. Guests looked at one another with wide eyes, unsure if they should leave or stay. The organist closed his book of sheet music, sat down, and waited in silence. By 12:15, the whispers turned to panic. The first person to truly break the silence was Jenny. She was only 14, still a child, but when her sister did not return, she ran through the churchyard shouting Lydia's name. Her small voice carried across the lawn, breaking through the murmurs of the guests. Some followed her, searching in the parking lot, calling out, "Lydia, honey, come back inside." Inside the church, David Harper stood at the altar, pale and trembling, his hands clenched and unclenched. The man who had looked steady and proud that morning now looked lost, like a child. He kept staring at the doors, as if expecting her to walk in at any moment. Richard Caldwell stormed through the church like a thundercloud, his face flushed red, his fists tight at his sides. "Where is she?" he demanded. He grabbed David by the arm, shaking him. "What did you do? Where did she go?" David pulled back, stammering, I don't know. She was just here." The scene unraveled quickly after that. Guests murmured in fear. Bridesmaids wept. Elaine Caldwell sat frozen in her pew, still holding the corsage meant for her daughter. Her lips moved silently, praying, whispering Lydia's name like a plea. By 12:30, someone called the police. The first squad car pulled into the churchyard just before 1 o'clock. 2 officers stepped out, expecting perhaps a runaway bride situation, some kind of embarrassing but harmless drama. They did not yet understand the depth of what was happening. They spoke first to David, then to Richard. Their questions were routine. Had Lydia been upset? Did she have cold feet? Was there anywhere she might have gone? At this stage, they still treated it like a disappearance born of nerves. But when they searched the building, when they looked in every room and every corner, they found nothing. Her purse still sat in the bridal suite. Her shoes were still there. Her car keys were in her bag. No clothes were missing. No sign of preparation. For a runaway, it made no sense. By mid-afternoon, the search had expanded. Officers walked the perimeter of the churchyard, their radios crackling. Volunteers checked cars and sheds. Someone brought out the first of the search dogs. The animals caught her scent on the path behind the church but lost it quickly at the edge of the woods. The woods themselves were dense, full of shadows and thick underbrush. Searchers pushed through the brambles, shouting her name until their voices were hoarse. They found nothing but birds scattering from the trees and the distant rush of the river. That night, when the sun went down, Maple Falls was transformed. Searchlights illuminated the churchyard. Neighbors walked the fields with flashlights. The sound of boots crunched on gravel. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The whole town felt it at once, that shift from excitement to dread. At the Caldwell house, chaos reigned. Family members whispered in the kitchen, speculating. Some said Lydia had run away. Some said David knew more than he was telling. Richard raged, pacing back and forth, slamming his fist into the table. Elaine wept quietly, still holding Lydia's bouquet, which now drooped with wilted petals. Jenny sat on the stairs, watching it all, silent and pale. She felt invisible, overlooked in the storm of adult panic. Later, she would remember only fragments. The sound of the phone ringing again and again, the voices of neighbors offering help, the look on her mother's face, hollowed out by fear. By Sunday morning, Lydia's face was everywhere. Flyers were printed overnight, photocopied in black and white. Her bridal portrait smiled back from lampposts and shop windows. People drove slowly through town, peering out their windows, scanning fields and yards. The local paper ran the headline, "Bride, missing on wedding day." Reporters showed up within 48 hours. News vans parked on Main Street. Microphones were shoved into neighbors' faces. Rumors spread faster than facts. One neighbor swore she saw a dark sedan parked outside the church that morning. Another claimed she heard a scream near the woods, though no one else heard it. Someone said Lydia had been writing letters to an old boyfriend. Someone else whispered that David had a temper. None of it could be proven, but all of it deepened the sense that something terrible had happened. Police held a press conference on Monday. The chief stood before the cameras, flanked by officers, and urged anyone with information to come forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. He had seen many cases in his years, but a bride vanishing in broad daylight was something new, something unnerving. Behind him, David sat with his hands folded, eyes downcast. Beside him, Richard stared straight into the cameras, his jaw tight, his voice low. "If anyone has my daughter, you bring her back. You hear me? You bring her back." The words carried through every living room in town that night. Still, the leads went nowhere. By the end of the first week, hope began to falter. Volunteers grew weary. The flyers started to curl at the edges. The flowers at the church turned brown in the heat. And Maple Falls settled into a new, awful rhythm. the rhythm of a community waiting for answers that never came. For the Caldwell family, the days blurred together. Elaine stayed up nights at the kitchen table, staring at the door, as if her daughter might walk through at any moment. Richard drank more than usual, his temper fraying with each day that passed. Jenny lay awake in bed, clutching her sister's pillow, the smell of her perfume fading slowly. David visited daily at first, sitting in the Caldwell living room with hollow eyes. He insisted Lydia loved him, that she would never just leave. But suspicion crept in around him, quiet and sharp. People asked why he did not know more, why he hadn't seen signs, why his story never changed. The whispers in town grew darker. And through it all, Lydia remained missing. The bride who had been ready to walk down the aisle had vanished into thin air, and Maple Falls was left with questions that seemed impossible to answer. What no one knew then was that somewhere, someone had captured her final moments on tape. A guest, a friend, a camera rolling when no one was paying attention. The tape would not be found for 35 years. But even without it, the panic of those first hours left a scar on Maple Falls that would never fade. In the first 48 hours, police still leaned on the idea of a runaway bride. They'd seen it before. They said women buckling under the pressure of marriage, slipping away at the last minute. But Maple Falls wasn't a city. It wasn't a place where someone could vanish into the crowd. Here, people knew each other's routines, what car they drove, even what they ordered at the diner. A runaway bride in Maple Falls had nowhere to hide. By the third day, the tone had changed. Detectives from the county sheriff's office were brought in. They set up a command post in the church basement, maps and photographs spread across long tables. On the chalkboard usually reserved for Sunday school lessons, someone wrote in large block letters, "Where is Lydia Caldwell?" The first step was the inner circle. They sat down with David Harper, the groom left standing at the altar. His hands shook as he answered questions. He told them everything he remembered. He had last seen Lydia that morning during photos. She smiled. She looked beautiful. She seemed nervous but happy. Then she disappeared. He swore he had no idea where she went. But investigators pressed. Had she ever talked about leaving? Did they argue? Did he notice anything strange? "No," David said, over and over. "She wouldn't leave me. She wouldn't." His voice cracked, his eyes filling with tears. Still, detectives noted his demeanor. The calmness mixed with desperation. The way his story never changed, which could mean he was telling the truth, or rehearsing a lie. Next came the Caldwells. Richard, her father, was furious during questioning. He snapped at officers, demanding why they weren't searching harder. He accused them of wasting time with interviews when they should be scouring the woods. When asked about Lydia's state of mind, he bristled. "She was fine. She was excited. She wanted this wedding. Don't you dare suggest otherwise." Elaine was softer, her hands twisted in her lap as she admitted Lydia had seemed nervous lately. She had doubts, but don't all brides? She loved David. She loved her family. She wouldn't just walk away. Then there was Jenny, only 14, sitting in a chair too big for her. She told detectives about the morning of the wedding, about finding her sister staring out the window. About the strange comment Lydia had made the night before. "This is the last night I'll ever be just me." Detectives wrote that one down carefully. By the end of that week, suspicion was spreading like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about David. He was the last person to see her. He had the most to lose. Some pointed out his temper, nothing violent, but enough to make people wonder. Had an argument flared that morning? Had something gone terribly wrong behind closed doors? Others whispered about Richard. His anger seemed too sharp, his defensiveness too quick. He had always been a controlling father, some said. Maybe Lydia had tried to stand up to him. Maybe it had ended badly. Still others whispered about a stranger. That dark sedan seen near the church, the screams someone swore they heard in the woods. Maybe it had been an outsider, a drifter, a criminal passing through. Theories branched like cracks in glass, and none of them pointed to certainty. Investigators expanded the search. They dragged the river 2 miles from the church. They brought in cadaver dogs to comb the fields. They knocked on every door within a 10-mile radius. They checked highways, bus stations, even airports, in case Lydia had fled. Every lead dissolved. One tip claimed she had been seen in Pittsburgh, walking with a man. Detectives drove out, interviewed the witness, and came back empty-handed. Another caller swore she was hiding at a cousin's house in Ohio. That cousin hadn't seen her in years. Even psychics called in. One described a vision of her trapped in a cabin in the woods. Another swore she saw water, always water. Police followed up half-heartedly, knowing these leads rarely panned out. And through it all, the Caldwell family unraveled. Richard grew more volatile, drinking late into the night, lashing out at reporters who camped outside their home. Elaine stopped sleeping, her once neat appearance crumbling into exhaustion. Jenny kept mostly silent, retreating into her room, writing in her diary things she would never say out loud. And David became a ghost of himself. He stopped shaving, stopped eating. He wandered the town, stopping at the diner, the hardware store, even the church, asking the same questions. Have you seen her? Did she say anything to you? His grief looked real. But then again, grief can look real even when it hides guilt. Within 2 weeks, the investigation stalled. No evidence, no witnesses, no body. Detectives debated theories late into the night. Some said it was a runaway. She had doubts. She wanted more from life. She slipped away. But the lack of preparation didn't fit. No money, no clothes, no plans. And Lydia was close to her family too, close to disappear without a word. Others believed in foul play, maybe an abduction, maybe an argument turned deadly. But without evidence, without even a trace of struggle, it was speculation stacked on speculation. The chief gave another press conference. He stood stiffly in front of microphones, repeating the same line. We are pursuing all leads. We urge the public to remain vigilant. Behind him, the family sat in silence, their grief broadcast across living rooms once again. But in private, even investigators admitted the truth. The case was already slipping into darkness. What haunted people most were the little things. The untouched breakfast on her plate that morning, the half-empty glass of champagne in the bridal suite, the bouquet left behind, petals wilting, her car sitting in the lot, keys still inside. These were not the details of someone who planned to run. These were the fragments of someone who vanished against her will. But against her will by whom? That question would echo for decades. And it would not be answered until the lost videotape came to light, 35 years later. For now, Maple Falls was a town of rumors, of unanswered questions, of suspicion eating away at trust. And Lydia Caldwell, the bride who had been ready to walk down the aisle, was nowhere to be found. By July of 1989, the official investigation had gone quiet. The flyers were still taped to telephone poles, curling in the summer heat, but the search parties had dwindled. The dogs were sent home. The maps were rolled up. Detectives still sat in the church basement, but their voices had grown weary, their notepads filled with questions that circled back on themselves. That silence created a vacuum. And in Maple Falls, a vacuum meant gossip. Every diner booth, every church pew, every line at the hardware store buzzed with whispers. Theories multiplied like vines, each twisting in a different direction. Everyone knew something. Everyone suspected someone. And soon, Lydia's disappearance stopped belonging to the Caldwells alone. It belonged to the town. One rumor insisted she had run away with a secret lover. It was Claire, her best friend with the camcorder, who suffered most under that theory. People whispered that Lydia had confided in her, that maybe the two of them shared more than friendship. Claire denied it fiercely. She told anyone who asked that Lydia had doubts, yes, but she was not the kind of girl who would vanish for passion's sake. Still, the whispers clung. In a small town, denial was never enough to erase suspicion. Another theory claimed Lydia had been taken by a stranger. People recalled the dark sedan parked near the church that morning, a vehicle no one could later identify. Some swore they saw it circling the block. Others said they saw a man leaning against it, smoking a cigarette, watching. Police never found the car, never found the man, but the idea of a predator lurking among them took root. Parents pulled their children closer. Women glanced over their shoulders at night. And then there were the darker whispers. Some said David had snapped, that he could not handle Lydia's doubts, that he had confronted her before the ceremony, that something terrible had happened in a hidden corner of the church. Others pointed the finger at Richard, her father, saying his temper had finally boiled over in a way that went too far. None of it was proven. None of it even had evidence. But in the absence of truth, speculation became currency. The press fanned the flames. News stations from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia ran segments on the runaway bride mystery. Reporters camped outside the Caldwell farmhouse, snapping photos of family members as they came and went. Tabloids invented salacious headlines. Bride vanishes into thin air, secret double life revealed. The Caldwells refused most interviews. They wanted privacy, but the more they refused, the more the public filled in the blanks with imagination. David, meanwhile, could not escape the spotlight. Cameras followed him to the hardware store, to the diner, to church on Sunday. Every gesture was dissected. Did he look sad enough? Did he look too sad? Was his grief genuine or rehearsed? At one point, a television crew caught him breaking down outside his house, collapsing against his porch steps, sobbing. The footage aired on the evening news, and opinions split down the middle. Half the town said, "Look at him, he's heartbroken." The other half said, "Look at him, he's performing." The truth was swallowed in the noise. As weeks turned into months, the investigation turned up, stranger and stranger leads. One caller claimed she had seen Lydia in Atlantic City, walking barefoot on the boardwalk. Another swore she was working at a diner in West Virginia under a new name. Detectives drove hours chasing these tips, only to find lookalikes or hoaxes. Psychics called in by the dozen. One mailed a hand-drawn map of the woods, with an X scrawled in red ink, claiming Lydia's body was buried there. Another sent a cassette tape of herself whispering, saying she could hear Lydia crying. Police followed up on none of it officially, but privately, some officers admitted they checked the map anyway. They found nothing. And then there was the letter. In late September, the Caldwell family received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled in block letters: "She is with me." The handwriting was jagged, almost childlike. Police analyzed it, ran it through databases, but found no match. Some believed it was a cruel prank, the work of someone watching the case on the news. Others whispered it was real, a message from whoever had taken her. The Caldwells kept the letter locked in a drawer. Elaine could not bear to look at it. Richard carried a photocopy folded in his wallet, as if staring at the words might give him some kind of clue. Jenny once snuck into her parents' room to read it. She said later the blocky letters haunted her dreams. By winter, the search had slowed to almost nothing. Snow fell over Maple Falls, covering the fields where search parties had once trampled through brush. The church bells rang on Sundays, but the pew where Lydia should have sat remained empty, draped in white roses that wilted in the cold air. The town adjusted, as towns do. Life moved forward in small ways. Weddings were held, babies were born, the mill kept running. But beneath it all, the absence of Lydia hung heavy, a silence people worked around but never forgot. In the diner, her favorite booth remained empty, at least for a while. At Christmas, the Caldwell house glowed with lights, but the laughter was hollow, the air thick with grief. David spent the holidays alone, his house dark except for a single lamp in the window. And yet the rumors never stopped. If anything, they grew more elaborate. Some swore she had joined a cult. Others whispered about a secret pregnancy, a child hidden somewhere. There were even stories of UFOs, sparked by the eerie fact that she had vanished so suddenly, without a trace. People joked nervously about her being beamed up, as if laughter might make the terror easier to swallow. The truth, of course, was much darker. But in 1989, no one knew that. Years later, when the videotape surfaced, people would look back on those months of rumors with shame. They would realize how quick they had been to invent stories, to point fingers, to feed on mystery instead of truth. But at the time, the rumors gave people something to cling to. Theories filled the void where answers should have been. They were desperate to explain how a bride could step into the hallway of a church and never come out again. The police had nothing. The family had nothing. The town had nothing but whispers. And so Lydia's case began its slow drift into the category everyone dreaded most: a cold case. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of joy, became an artifact of tragedy. The church where she was last seen became a place of ghost stories, and the people who loved her most began to live with an unbearable truth: that she might never come home. What no one realized was that the answer, the horrifying, undeniable answer, had already been recorded. On a tape forgotten in a box, in a house not far from Maple Falls, the truth sat waiting for decades. But in 1989, all Maple Falls had were rumors. When the calendar turned to 1990, the case of the vanished bride was already growing cold. The flyers had been taken down. The news crews had packed up their vans and left. The church had hosted other weddings since, the pews once again filled with laughter and flowers. But for the Caldwell family, time had not moved forward at all. It had stopped on June 17th, 1989, the day Lydia vanished. In the first year, the family still clung to hope. Richard walked the fields himself long after the police gave up. He carried a flashlight at night, trudging through tall grass, shouting her name until his throat was raw. Elaine kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been, the dress still hanging, the vanity still covered in makeup, as if Lydia might walk back through the door any moment. Jenny wrote letters to her sister in a diary, addressing them like Lydia was simply away on a long trip. But as months turned into years, hope turned into ritual. Every June 17th, the family gathered at the church. They placed white roses on the altar, the same flowers that had once decorated Lydia's wedding. The pastor would say a few words. Sometimes, neighbors came. Sometimes, reporters showed up, their cameras clicking as the family stood in silence. At home, Elaine lit a candle in the kitchen window every night. She told people it was to guide Lydia home. Richard stopped going to church. He said he could not sit in the pews and stare at the doorway where his daughter had walked out and never returned. Jenny grew quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped telling people her sister would come home. She stopped telling people much of anything at all. The police case file thickened with dust. Every few months, a new detective would glance through it, scribble some notes, maybe follow up on an old tip. Each time, the trail went nowhere. By the mid-90s, the case had been officially labeled inactive. Lydia Caldwell was classified as missing, presumed dead. That phrase crushed Elaine. Presumed dead. She refused to accept it. If they don't have a body, she said again and again, then she's still out there. She clung to that technicality with a mother's stubbornness, even as the years made the possibility smaller and smaller. Richard, though, grew bitter. He snapped at reporters who dared to bring up his daughter's name. He cursed the police at town meetings. He carried the anger in his shoulders, in his jaw, in his silence. People said he aged 10 years in the first two after Lydia vanished. And David the groom, who never got his bride, he became a ghost. In the early years, David stayed close to the Caldwells. He joined the searches, sat in their living room, cried alongside them. He visited the police station weekly, asking for updates. But as time passed, his visits grew less frequent. Some thought it was guilt. Others thought it was simply the pain of staring at what he had lost. By the mid-90s, David had moved to another town. He never remarried, never started a family. People said he still carried her wedding ring in his pocket. Others claimed he left flowers on her grave marker every June 17th, even though there was no grave, just a headstone with her name and the dates left unfinished. Some in Maple Falls pitied him. Others still suspected him. Decades did nothing to erase the division. The town itself changed in small, steady ways. The paper mill closed in the late 90s, sending families scattering for work elsewhere. The hardware store passed down to David's cousins. The church installed electric bells instead of the hand-rung ones Lydia had grown up hearing. But no change erased the memory of the bride who vanished. For a time, teenagers used the churchyard as a place to scare each other on summer nights. They whispered that Lydia's ghost haunted the pews, waiting for her wedding march. Some swore they saw her figure in a window, still in her gown, still waiting. For older folks, though, the story was less a ghost tale and more a wound. They avoided speaking her name in public, as if silence might protect them from the reminder. When new families moved into Maple Falls and asked about the Caldwell girl, the answers were short, clipped. She went missing, people said. Nothing more. The silence became its own kind of folklore. For the Caldwell family, life became a long stretch of grief, punctuated by milestones Lydia never reached. When Jenny graduated high school, she looked for her sister in the crowd. When she left for college, she cried in her dorm room, writing in her diary, "You should be here. You should be telling me how to do this." When Mark, the older brother, had his first child, he placed a framed picture of Lydia in the nursery, telling his daughter about the aunt she would never meet. And when Richard and Elaine celebrated their 30th anniversary, they left the extra chair at the table empty. Every event was shadowed by absence. In the early 2000s, cold case television shows began contacting the family. Producers promised new leads, new experts, new technology. A few times, the Caldwells agreed, appearing on programs where bright lights and somber narrators recounted Lydia's disappearance. Each time, it brought a flood of new tips. Each time, it ended the same, with nothing. The exposure kept her story alive, but it also kept the wound fresh. Jenny once said she hated those shows because they froze her sister in time. "She's always 23, always in that dress," she said. "But I got older, we all did, and she never got the chance." By then, Jenny was a mother herself. She told her children about their Aunt Lydia, describing her not just as a victim, but as a whole person. The way she laughed, the way she sang in the kitchen, the way she doodled wedding dresses in her notebooks. She wanted them to know Lydia as she was, not just as the missing bride on a poster. But even as life continued, the grief never left. It just became quieter, more private. Every June 17th, the rituals continued. White roses at the church, candles in the window, a headstone with no body. Neighbors stopped attending after a while. Reporters stopped showing up. The crowd dwindled until only the family remained. Still, they went. Still, they stood in silence. For 35 years, they waited. And then, in 2024, the waiting ended. Because hidden in a dusty box in a stranger's attic, a videotape surfaced. A videotape that would show Lydia's final moments. It had been 35 years since the bride walked into a church hallway and never returned. By 2024, Maple Falls was a different place. The mill was long gone. Main Street had more empty storefronts than businesses. The church where Lydia was last seen still stood, its paint chipped, its stained glass windows faded, but the pews were rarely full anymore. For the Caldwell family, the years had stripped away more than hope. Richard had passed in 2009, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Elaine followed in 2016, her candle still burning in the kitchen window the night she died. Jenny, now nearly 50, was the only one left carrying the weight. She still placed roses at the church every June 17th. She still told her children about their Aunt Lydia. She still lived with the question that had never been answered. And then, in the spring of 2024, the answer appeared in the most unexpected way. It began with an estate sale. In a nearby town, a man named Thomas was cleaning out his late uncle's house. The uncle had been something of a hoarder, the kind of man who never threw anything away. Attic boxes spilled with old clothes, receipts, tools, and stacks of VHS tapes. Most were unlabeled, their plastic cases cracked with age. Thomas almost tossed them all into the trash, but one tape caught his eye. A faded white sticker on the side read, in smudged black marker, "Caldwell Wedding, 1989. He didn't think much of it at first. He figured his uncle must have filmed a wedding decades ago, maybe as a favor, maybe because he liked fiddling with his camcorder, but curiosity got the better of him. He still had an old VCR in his garage. One evening, he slid the tape in and pressed play. The footage was grainy, colors washed out with age. The camera wobbled as it zoomed in on the church, the guests milling about, the flowers strung along the pews. People laughed, waved at the lens, and fussed with their hair. A voice behind the camera chuckled, making offhand comments about the decorations. And then he saw her. Lydia, radiant in her gown, adjusting her veil, smiling shyly as the camera panned across her. Thomas froze. He remembered the name. Everyone in Maple Falls did, even after all these years. The bride who vanished. He sat there, heart pounding, as the tape continued. It showed the bridesmaids sipping champagne, the groomsmen joking, the photographer arranging poses, ordinary wedding footage. But then, near the end of the tape, the footage shifted. The camcorder was running when Lydia stepped into the hallway at 11:15. It caught her smiling at her bridesmaids, setting her bouquet down, and slipping away. The camera panned, almost absent-mindedly, and followed her as she walked toward the side entrance. The lens wobbled, zoomed slightly, and caught a figure at the far end of the hall. A shadow. The quality was poor, but it was unmistakable. A man stood waiting. Lydia froze for a moment, glancing back as if uncertain. Then she moved toward him. The footage jittered as the cameraman shifted, distracted, not realizing what he had captured. The man stepped forward, just enough to reveal part of his face, enough to be recognized. And then, the tape cut off. Static filled the screen. Thomas sat in stunned silence. He knew instantly what he had found was not just family footage. It was evidence. The last known moments of a woman whose disappearance had haunted the town for 35 years. He called the police the next morning. Within days, the tape was in the hands of cold case detectives. Forensic analysts worked carefully to preserve it, transferring the degraded VHS into digital form, enhancing the images frame by frame. And when the footage was slowed down, sharpened, and studied, it revealed something chilling. The man in the hallway was not a stranger. He was someone from Maple Falls, someone who had been there all along. The news spread like wildfire. For weeks, Maple Falls buzzed with the revelation. Headlines blared across Pennsylvania. Lost videotape surfaces in vanished bride case. Reporters returned to the quiet town, their cameras pointed once again at the church, the farmhouse, the hardware store. People who had long since given up hope now spoke of Lydia again, her name on everyone's lips. Some wept, some whispered, some shook their heads in disbelief. For Jenny, it was like reopening a wound that had never healed. She had lived 35 years without her sister, raising her children, burying her parents, always carrying the weight of not knowing. Now, suddenly, there was a chance at answers, a chance at truth. But truth is never simple. Because the man on the tape, the figure in the hallway, was someone she recognized instantly. Someone she had seen at family gatherings, church services, town events. Someone she never imagined could be connected to her sister's disappearance. When the footage was released to investigators, they pieced together what had likely happened that day. Lydia hadn't simply vanished. She had walked into the hallway, seen a familiar face, and followed. She hadn't been running away. She had been lured. The weight of that realization crashed over Maple Falls like a storm. For 35 years, people had whispered about strangers, about sedans, about runaway brides. But the truth was far closer. The truth had been in the footage all along. It had just taken decades to find it. That discovery changed everything. The investigation, long dormant, was suddenly alive again. Detectives pored over the footage, tracked down surviving witnesses, and reopened files. Reporters dug into old gossip, reprinting names and faces from 1989. The people of Maple Falls, now older, grayer, and more weary, watched as their town's darkest mystery reignited in front of them. And for Jenny, for the family that had waited so long, there was finally a chance at closure. But closure would come with a price. Because the videotape did not just reveal a face, it revealed a betrayal. The man waiting for Lydia in that hallway wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone she trusted, someone who should have protected her. And that revelation would shatter everything the town thought it knew. The videotape sat on the table like an unassuming relic. A plastic shell, scuffed and dusty, its label faded to a ghost of ink. Yet inside it was the one thing Maple Falls had been missing for 35 years, the truth. Detectives threaded it into a refurbished VCR, a technician hovering nearby, ready to digitize and stabilize the footage. The screen blinked, wavered, and then, suddenly, the past came alive. At first, it was ordinary wedding footage. Guests fanning themselves in the June heat, bridesmaids giggling, Lydia radiant, nervously adjusting her veil. For minutes, the tape seemed like nothing more than nostalgia, a time capsule of joy. But then came the part no one had seen. 11:15, Lydia in the hallway. She set her bouquet down, smoothed her gown, and turned toward the side corridor. The camcorder, still rolling, panned lazily with her. And at the end of the hall, half in shadow, a man was waiting. The footage was shaky, but the details were there. A dark suit, the flash of a watch on his wrist, a hand lifting, palm open, beckoning. A faint voice beneath the hiss of static, low and reassuring. Lydia hesitated, looked back once, and then she moved toward him. Moments later, the tape cut to static. 35 years of speculation collapsed into that single fragment. The bride hadn't bolted. She hadn't been dragged screaming into the woods. She had been lured away by someone she trusted. The lab froze the image frame by frame. They enhanced the light, pulled detail from shadow, filtered the audio, until the hiss gave way to the ghost of a laugh. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They saw the glint of a ring on his right hand, a heavy signet ring, worn down by decades. They caught the outline of a face, profile half-turned, unmistakable to anyone who had lived in Maple Falls long enough. It wasn't a stranger. When Jenny Caldwell was brought in to see the footage, she didn't hesitate. Her eyes filled and her voice cracked as she whispered the name, a man she'd known her entire life. A man who had hugged her at the rehearsal dinner. A man she had trusted. Earl Whitman. The discovery knocked the air out of Maple Falls. For decades, people had chased shadows, the dark sedan by the church, the rumor of a lover in another town, the possibility of a runaway bride. No one had ever suspected Earl. He was a deacon at the church, a steady presence, a man who fixed locks, organized bake sales, and prayed over funerals. He was the kind of man people waved to on Main Street without a second thought. But there he was, in the grainy footage, waiting for Lydia, reaching out to her. Detectives dug into the archives. Earl had been at the church early that morning, helping set up. He had keys to every door, knew every hallway. Multiple witnesses remembered him stepping away around 11, only to return just before noon, claiming he'd needed air. The tape had captured more than just his presence. In one jittering sweep of the camera, a silver punch bowl reflected the hallway like a warped mirror. There, stretched and distorted, was the shape of two figures, Lydia in white and Earl beside her, his hand lifted in that same beckoning gesture. The signet ring flashed, and in its curve was a small notch, a chip Earl had carried for years, the kind only someone familiar would notice. When investigators compared it to old photographs, church committee portraits, picnic snapshots, candid shots from the rehearsal dinner, the match was perfect. The same ring, the same watch, the same man. The pieces slid together. Earl knew Lydia had doubts. Everyone close to her did. To him, it wasn't just nerves. It was a threat to the families, to the town, to the reputation of the church. He saw himself as a fixer, the one who kept order. So when Lydia stepped into that hallway, he intercepted her. Maybe he only meant to talk, to persuade, to nudge her back toward the altar. But in that quiet space, with her saying no and him unwilling to hear it, something broke. Investigators believe he led her down the narrow stairwell to the old boiler room, a place few even remembered existed. The struggle was brief. The silence afterward lasted decades. When renovations sealed the crawl space in the late 90s, Lydia was entombed beneath the very church where people prayed for her return. Jenny stood outside when the forensic team carried the boxes up from under the floor. She didn't ask to see what they had found. She only pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, "She's coming home." Her parents had gone to their graves without answers, but now, at last, she had them. Earl Whitman never faced justice. He died in 2012, his headstone reading, "Faithful Servant," the irony twisted in the stomachs of those who now knew the truth. But among his belongings, tucked in a drawer, investigators found a notebook. Most pages were blank. On the last page, in neat handwriting, were 4 words written again and again. She was almost ready. The meaning was unclear. Was it his attempt to justify what he'd done? A delusion that she would have gone through with it if only he'd convinced her? Or something darker still, an admission that he had silenced her before she could choose? No one knows. What Maple Falls does know is this: the bride who vanished on her wedding day didn't leave. She was taken by someone she trusted, someone who stood in the very heart of their community. And for 35 years, the truth sat waiting in a cardboard box, sealed in magnetic tape, waiting to be seen. The name had been whispered for decades in Maple Falls, whispered in admiration, not suspicion. He was a man people trusted, a man who had carried casseroles into grieving homes, who fixed broken locks at the church, who offered rides when cars failed in the cold. He had been part of the fabric of the community for so long that no one ever looked at him twice. Until the videotape. Frame by frame, the truth emerged. The ring, the watch, the voice caught just beneath the hiss of static, a hand reaching out, beckoning, and a face, familiar and steady, the kind of face that never belonged in a crime story, but there it was. The man who lured Lydia Caldwell away from her wedding was not a stranger in a dark sedan. He was Earl Whitman, a deacon of the church, a longtime family friend, a man who had been standing in the very pews as the search began. When detectives confirmed it, the shock rippled outward. For 35 years, people had imagined everything except this. They had blamed drifters, jealous lovers, even her own groom. But not Earl, never Earl. Jenny Caldwell sat in silence when they told her. She was 50 years old now, her hair streaked with gray, her children grown. She had waited her entire life for this moment, and when it finally came, she didn't cry. She only whispered, "I knew him. He hugged me at the rehearsal dinner." The betrayal was a second wound layered over the first. The reconstruction of that day came slowly, carefully pieced together from the tape, from the archives, from fragments of memory that had lived in people's minds like splinters. At 11:15, Lydia stepped into the hallway. She had doubts about her marriage, doubts she had whispered only to her sister and her best friend. Earl knew. People talked. He was the kind of man who always had an ear in every conversation. He believed it was his duty to keep order, to make sure the wedding went ahead, to keep appearances intact. He waited at the end of the corridor, just out of sight from the bridal suite. When Lydia saw him, she hesitated. He lifted a hand, palm open, the way someone does when they're saying, "It's fine. Just come talk." And Lydia, who had known him since childhood, who had trusted him as part of her community, stepped toward him. What happened in the next minutes will never be known in detail. But investigators believe he led her down the corridor, through the fire door that stuck in summer humidity, into the old stairwell that smelled of dust and boiler heat. He meant, perhaps, to calm her, to reason with her. But when she said no, when she said she wasn't sure she could go through with the wedding, something in him snapped. A man used to being obeyed, a man who saw himself as a pillar, could not accept her defiance. The struggle was brief. The silence afterward lasted 35 years. Forensics teams, working beneath the fellowship hall, found what had been hidden all that time: bones, fragments of fabric, a small clasp from a veil. The crawl space had been sealed during renovations in the late 90s, trapping her beneath the church where people still sang hymns and prayed, never knowing she was only feet away. Jenny stood outside when they carried the boxes out. She did not ask to see them. She only pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "She's coming home." The town reeled. People who had known Earl for decades refused to believe it at first. Some defended him, even after the evidence. But the tape did not lie. The reflection in the punch bowl, the profile in the shadows, the ring with the tiny nick that matched exactly, piece by piece, the illusion of his goodness fell away. Earl had died in 2012, never facing justice. He was buried in Maple Falls Cemetery, a headstone polished smooth, the words, "Faithful Servant," carved into the stone. The irony curdled in the stomachs of those who knew the truth now. There would be no trial, no confession, only the revelation of what he had done, and the reckoning of a community that had trusted him. For Jenny, the closure was both relief and agony. Relief that she finally knew what happened. Agony that her parents had gone to their graves never knowing. She stood at her sister's new headstone, this time not just a name and a blank dash, but real dates, carved in stone at last. June 17th, 1989, it read. The day Lydia was supposed to begin a new life had become the day her life ended. At the funeral, people wept openly. David Harper, the groom left standing at the altar, came forward with white roses. His hair was thin now, his back stooped, but his love for Lydia had not dimmed. He placed the roses on her casket and whispered, "I knew you wouldn't have left me." Jenny's children sang a hymn Lydia used to love, their voices trembling. And for the first time in 35 years, the Caldwell family laid her to rest. But one detail lingered. Among Earl Whitman's belongings, tucked in the back of a drawer, investigators found a small notebook. Most of the pages were blank. On the final page, in neat, careful handwriting, he had written the same line 3 times. She was almost ready. The words offered no explanation, no remorse, only a chilling echo of a man who believed he had been in control. To this day, people in Maple Falls argue about what he meant. Some say he believed Lydia would have changed her mind if he had only convinced her. Others believe it was a justification, a way to rewrite his crime into something less monstrous. Jenny keeps the notebook locked away. She does not need to read it again. She has her sister back now. That is enough. But for the town, the words linger, like a whisper that refuses to fade. She was almost ready. And Maple Falls will never forget the bride who vanished on her wedding day, and the secret that lay waiting in the shadows for 35 years.